Hi, this is Brad Pilcher. Today's episode is one of a number of efforts that AJFF is going to be making to address the Black Lives Matter movement and recent protests against racial injustice. In addition to this podcast episode, this Thursday, June 25th at 7:30 p.m., we will also be hosting a webinar discussing Every Mother's Son, a powerful and heartbreaking story of three ordinary women turned activists whose sons were unjustly killed by New York City police officers. Please register at ajff.org/inconversation.
Hi, I'm Sara Glassberg.
I'm Brad Pilcher.
And this is AJFF In Conversation, the podcast where we talk about all things Jewish film. In today's episode, we are exploring issues of racism, discrimination, and injustice. We had originally planned to do a whole episode on films centering on the Olympics, timed to come out next month when the Olympics would have been starting.
In the wake of the murder of George Floyd by white police officers in Minneapolis and the ensuing protests around the message of Black Lives Matter, we felt like we needed to talk in some way about the Black experience on film.
That's when we realized one particular film about the 1936 Olympics in Berlin might be perfect for that conversation.
Obviously, systemic racism, injustice, the violence of the police, these are all topics of utmost relevance to today. So why would a documentary about an Olympics from 84 years ago be of interest to this discussion?
Screened at the 2017 AJFF, Olympic Pride, American Prejudice reveals the often forgotten history of the 17 other African-American athletes besides Jesse Owens who competed in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin.
These athletes represented a challenge to prejudice both in Germany and in the USA, and they encountered more than their fair share of that prejudice, particularly back home in the country they were representing on the world stage.
And, as Brad mentioned, the stories of these Black sports heroes and the struggles they faced here in America, and not just in Nazi Germany, for equity and equality, for rights and respect, feel especially important to look at in both a historical and contemporary context.
So to help us do that, and to also discuss the making of the film and her work as a Black filmmaker, we have the director, writer, and producer, Deborah Riley Draper. Deborah, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's my pleasure, Brad. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be with you guys. We have a long-standing partnership now. We've been working on programs and initiatives since the release of Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, the film in 2016. And now there's a book that came out of the film for 2020. So I'm so glad to be back to chat with you.
Thank you for mentioning the book, because that saves me the trouble of having to do it. Can you tell us a little bit about the book and how that contrasts with the film and how that got made?
Absolutely. So in 2016, Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, the documentary about the 18 African Americans who defied Hitler and Jim Crow to win hearts and medals at the 1936 Summer Olympic Games, was released. And obviously, it was a part of your film festival. The executive producer of the film, Blair Underwood, had released many books on Simon & Schuster. The folks at Simon & Schuster saw the film and thought, wow, how much research went into doing this film? And I explained that there was 4 years of research, and a significant portion of that research obviously can't make it into the film. And we talked about doing a deeper dive into the lives of these athletes and really comparing and contrasting what was happening in America versus what was happening in Germany during that period. So 400 pages later, Olympic Pride, American Prejudice, the book was born. And the book really lets you get a closer look at the childhood of these athletes, the Great Migration, and lots of the big movements and historically significant things that were happening with African Americans from the late 20s through the end of the 30s, and the Great Migration being one of them, Jim Crow being one of them, lynching being one of them. So there were a lot of cultural and social and political things happening. And then we contrast that starting in Germany with Adolf Hitler in jail. And we begin to build the stories until the two separate stories cross at the 1936 Summer Olympic Games.
You have this poetic ability to juxtapose things. Hitler in jail is not a starting point I would have immediately thought of, but when you say it, it makes perfect sense to sort of see his rise from that point juxtaposed with the story of the Black athletes and what was going on in Black America at the time.
Absolutely. So there are a lot of really subtle, oppressive, racist things that will occur in parallel, right? So it's kind of interesting to be able to look at these two things in granular detail.
Yeah. So this is a book which, for those who don't have it, I think it came out in February, and they should absolutely rush out to buy it. The film is amazing. It's a story that's powerful, but what I guess makes me sad is that it's a story set, 9 decades ago, and it seems incredibly relevant in a way that I wish it wasn't. I'm curious what your thoughts are about how the film speaks to the present day, even though it's looking at events that took place almost a century ago.
Brad, we're completely aligned. I'm astonished at how eerily similar 1936 is to 2020. 1936 was an election year in America. 2020 is an election year in America. In Germany, there was a big march toward nationalism and restoring Germany to its previous, its pre-World War I significance. So there was a lot of nationalism. There was a lot of rise to Aryan supremacy and really the beginning of horrific oppression, marginalization, and murder and genocide. Jewish people in Germany and many other races and ethnic groups. So this kind of police state in Germany that was legislated in a way to kill, that rings so very true. Right now in America, we are protesting inequality. There's tremendous civil unrest, and I'm very proud of that, actually, because when you see something, you need to say something, right? In 1936, when America was deciding, actually 1935, 1934, when America was deciding whether or not to participate in the Berlin Olympic Games, lots of people saw things that were wrong and no one said anything. And we participated in the games, which was great. But sometimes, even if your government is doing something wrong, it feels, like you're too small as a citizen to stand up and say that crime against humanity is more than what I'm going to be able to take from my government, and I want to say something. So I think there are lots of parallels. I think the idea of the ruthless lynchings and a lot of the vigilante actions that were happening in America in the 30s, we're seeing that play out again in 2020. You're seeing a race of people supported by other races saying enough is enough. We must protect humanity. We must treat all people equally. We can't exterminate or kill or get rid of one race over the other. And so this idea of Aryan supremacy, Aryan supremacy or white privilege, these things collide, they coincide, they run parallel. But what they do is they split countries apart and they pit citizens against one another. And we can't find love, unity, or peace unless we actually can ensure that everyone enjoys the freedom of democracy equally, fairly, and with great equity.
I think that's all extremely, as you said, relevant. I think you articulated it exactly how, Brad and I have been thinking about these things, obviously from our lived experience, and it's very different. But something I wanted to ask, kind of pivoting a little bit into the current moment and taking that question a little bit further as far as what's different now, what's similar now, and something I was struck by rewatching the film is this almost dichotomy between fetishizing and commodifying the Black body and what it can do, and the idea that it's on display in this very athletic, this world stage of the Olympics, and how that's similar or different to Black athletes and celebrities today. But we expect them to perform. We expect them to do what we want them to do in this controlled way. And I'm just curious to see what you think about that, how that's sort of translated into today's climate and circumstances, and how that's similar or different to, that kind of push and pull between what the Black athletes were doing in the 36 Olympics.
There's a long-standing question: can you be both Negro and American? That question was posed in 1903. So in 1936, when these 18 African-American athletes made the team, this was a great moment for them. This was a great moment for America, for their community, for everyone. But the idea of Black athletes raising their voices was not accepted. Athletes were expected to represent the USA and not in any way represent the idea that the USA did not represent them, that they did not have the full opportunity to be citizens. So fast forward to 2020, fast forward backwards to 1936, that body didn't belong to you as an individual citizen. In sports, we have owners of teams. So those owners make the rules, right? So the owners want to control what you do with your body. So if you take a knee, or if you choose to express your patriotism in a different way, or if you choose to use your voice in a way in which the owners, which can be likened to plantation owners, decide that's not appropriate for their business, there's a clash. So Black bodies, male or female, have been seen as threats when they're running, right? So if you're running down the street, if I'm running down the street, that gives people pause. That's a threat. But if I'm running on a track, on a court, or in a stadium, that running has been sanctioned by the mainstream. So I am safe for that moment that I'm running the 40, for that moment that I'm running the 100. That Black body is safe because that Black body is being used in a manner in which the institutions deem it appropriate. So having agency over your own body in 1936, in 2020, is something we all strive for. And African Americans in particular, we want to be able to walk down the street and get a Snapple, or go for a jog, or go watch a bird in Central Park without the mere presence of our bodies creating an imaginary threat.
When we were talking about this episode before today, one of the things that you mentioned when you talked about running on the street versus running on the track was the presence of a starting gun. And to me, again, this poetry of juxtaposition, the gun that shoots Ahmaud Arbery because he's running in a neighborhood where they don't think he should be there. And then you have the starting pistol that signals the start of a race. And in two different contexts, one is acceptable. But it always, when you said that, it always struck me, because in that moment I realized when I was a kid, I asked my dad why they shot a gun to start a race. It seemed peculiar to me. I remember watching Olympics as a child, watching track and field races, and I just thought, that's a weird way to start a race. And I'd have no idea what the history, he didn't know, I don't know what the history is, but it is that juxtaposition of violence, of weaponry, of a controlled environment, of competition, of all of those things that are mixed together. And there is a sort of disturbing poetry to it, if you will.
There's a very disturbing poetry to it because, for me, you think of the overseer with the gun on the horse, letting everyone know who's bossing this particular set of labor, how you work, where you work, when you can start, when you can stop. So all of that, the connections to it are strong, and the connections go back to one set of people dominating, having a dominant narrative, a dominant perspective, and domination over another. So there's a direct correlation, Brad, for sure.
And you started your movie with a race, a starting gun, and then the commentary that rightfully seems odd when you listen to it now of the announcer as the black athlete catches up to the lead, that Negro's dangerous, he says. And it's a weird thing to say, he's running around a circle. But that language, that sense of dominance, that sense of unconscious language is something that came through very powerfully for me in your film. It's come through very powerfully in the protests that are going on in society today. The ways in which we use language to reinforce or to question the dominant narrative, the dominant social constructs that we have, where there is control and authority and where there is not control and authority and who has the power. It was an interesting way to start the movie, and I think a powerful one, because it showed you just how much of an inherent threat just a black athlete, just a black person represented, because they could run fast, that they were dangerous.
Yes, we chose that particular because that's journalism, right? That's really the dominant media facilitating how we begin to think and see about Black athletes internationally on an international stage, how we compare. He says he's a Black Panther, that Negro's dangerous. So these very words, while they may seem like colorful play-by-play, these are the words that pour into people, into their consciousness. And these are sometimes the words that can create actions that are actually dangerous to other people. Because if someone thinks you're dangerous, if someone thinks you're a threat, their behavior changes. Even if you're just out there, like I said, bird watching or running, that what the other person may believe can cause tremendous harm to someone simply based on the color of their skin. So I wanted those words to be seared in people's consciousness, to hear that the mere fact that a man is running in a race, that he would be considered dangerous.
Something else that this conversation and your film makes me think of is, again, speaking a little bit to the idea of a dichotomy. I find it so fascinating that Hitler, of course, was clinging to this myth of obviously Aryan white superiority and Black inferiority. And just the way that, as much as we're saying that things haven't changed, I'm always fascinated by the way that racism seems to just evolves, and it puts on different masks over time. And so I always think about Get Out, because that's one of my favorite films. And I think that's a film that brought similar lessons to white audiences who wouldn't know what these experiences were like. And it was this mainstream horror movie, of course. And the character that, you have this father say, oh, well, my father was beaten by Jesse Owens in the 36 Olympics. And then, sorry for a kind of spoiler alert here for anyone who hasn't seen Get Out, but you find out later that white man is now inhabiting a Black body so that he can run. And you see this Black man running. And so I think that just speaks again to the idea of control and the way in which now there's this dual kind of inferiority, superiority thing that that white systems and people project onto Black people. I don't know if you want to speak to that, but that's kind of what this brings out in my mind.
Well, it's Sarah, it's the craziest thing, right? Because scientific racism, which was really the dominant thinking in the late 1800s and into the 1900s, and the scientific racism in the United States gave birth to eugenics, which inspired Adolf Hitler to sterilize. Because in the United States, we sterilized people that we thought were weak or were not smart. And that went on for years. And the vast majority of the people sterilized were African American women. So scientific racism, on the one hand, would say African Americans didn't have the wherewithal to compete in the Olympics because this was an elite sport that required both physical prowess and intellectual prowess. But at the same time, through slavery, the price of the Black body was higher if you were bigger and stronger and you could pick cotton faster, or if you could breed. So all of these things around the physicality of a Black body that equated to profitability for someone else, but not the person, because that person, as I said, didn't have agency over their own body. But that profitability attached to the physicality was accepted, but the sheer agency of the physicality was not.
I'm curious, Deborah, you've probably done more research than I have on this question, but there does seem to be an inherent contradiction to racist attitudes. When you think about the idea of the dumb Black person who's not capable because they're Black, they're inferior, they're mentally weaker, all of that, then you contrast that with this notion of the physical Black specimen, the Black man who's going to prey on white women, who can run fast, who's able to weather the heat in the fields because they're Black. And to me, it's a plain as day contradiction that just sort of always seemed very obvious and always seemed to show the lies inherent in racist beliefs. But at the same time, the people who say those things, who behave in that way, don't seem self-aware of the contradiction. And I don't know if it's because they are genuinely not self-aware, or if it's just because the message that they're spreading, the language that they're using, is a tool, and they're just wielding it to maintain power and authority. And they know that they're contradicting themselves. They know that what they're saying is crap, but it's effective. It's a tool that works to keep them privileged and in power, so they go with it. And I'm not sure which is worse, to be honest.
Well, propaganda is always effective. It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be blasted in the dominant narrative. So the people that wanted to send the message of inferiority of African Americans did that selfishly, and they were most definitely self-aware, because institutionalized racism is self-aware, because it perpetuates itself and it tries to protect itself and maintain its position. So it's very keenly aware of what it does. You can see that play out in the history of the United States with the very significant body of legislation that subjugates and oppresses and marginalizes African Americans and tons of other races. So if you weren't self-aware, you wouldn't be able to very clearly write out laws that really put people's livelihoods in jeopardy. Very early on in the United States, in Virginia, very clearly, and in many other states, the first thing was, we do not want our slaves to learn how to read. So that was a law. So that's very self-aware. So you want to begin to create inferiority by creating opportunities for you to have better everything. So separate but equal was never equal.
Why did they let them go? Why did they let these 18 Black athletes go to the Olympics in the first? There was clearly racism. The film really gets into a little bit of the racism at the top of the American Olympic group, the AAU. And, it seems that it was propaganda. It seems that it was a vehicle to contrast America with Germany. But at the same time, they were clearly threatened. You had Black athletes who were sent, and then they were pulled at the last minute for a white athlete. You had one of the boxers, I'm blanking on his name, had to literally fight the same guy before they got on the ship, and then while they were on the ship, just to keep his spot, and he still lost his spot. So I don't know why they sent them in the first place.
The thing about racism and the thing about oppression is there's contradiction, right? Because on the one hand, and for Avery Brundage in particular, who was responsible for these decisions, he wanted to field the best team in history and beat everyone, including the Germans, because he wanted to represent America and he wanted America to look good. And President Roosevelt, who was the co-chair of the American Olympic Committee, wanted America to show up big and strong and dominant. And these 18 athletes had the speed. They were the best in the country of any race. So, of course, they made the team purely by time, right? Because the thing about track is, this gun we speak of goes off and whoever has the best speed wins. So the winners get on the boat, and for 10 days, they sail to Germany and everything's great and everyone's happy. We've got this American team. But once in Germany and these African-American athletes start winning, there were discussions between Avery Brundage and the Nazis about Hitler being completely unhappy with losing to Negroes. And so a lot of politics played a role in Louise Stokes not being able to run. And really for, Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller, the two Jewish athletes who came to Germany to run the relay, they were benched because Hitler was not interested in seeing two incredibly fast Jewish sprinters run on that relay team. So they didn't get to participate in the Olympics at all in any competition. They were benched. And the U.S. won the gold medal in that race. And what's ironic about that is one of Jesse Owens' gold medals. And imagine what that team would have looked like if it was Ralph Metcalfe, Jesse Owens, Sam Stoller, and Marty Glickman winning the gold.
Yeah, actually, it's one thing that I am consciously not diving into much here is in the film, you do speak about Jewish athletes who also face discrimination. And we've had films at the festival. We had a film just about Marty Glickman. And that story is a powerful story, but I also kind of want to avoid it at this moment because one of the things that I'm struggling with, and maybe I shouldn't be, but there is a long history of a partnership between the Jewish community and the Black community around civil rights, Jews and Blacks, the founding of the NAACP, Jews and Blacks marching in the 1960s. And I don't want to lose sight of that. And I want to encourage that partnership. But I'm also very conscious of the fact that the types of discrimination that both communities faced were different. And there were certainly members of the Jewish community who were also not actively allied in the fight for civil rights. And that part of the history is there too. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about the discrimination faced by Jewish athletes because I'm just uncomfortable with the parallel because I don't think they're actually quite parallel. But I don't know how you feel when you dive into that in the history.
No, it's not parallel, but it exists. And so for me, it's important that we talk about discrimination and racism and that it exists and it exists in different ways for different ethnic groups, right? When you have the opportunity to not look and be Black, then there's certainly less immediate discrimination. Obviously, African Americans have a different relationship to America because we were intentionally enslaved, and it makes everyone uncomfortable to talk about this part of our history. Racism and discrimination and oppression is uncomfortable. It doesn't feel good. And it certainly doesn't feel good when you have to experience it every single day. And it doesn't feel good when you're forced to talk about it. But we have to have these conversations. They're tough. They're hard. They make everyone sitting at the table wish the conversation would go away. But until we just have these conversations and we talk about what America has done for the past 400 years, We have an uncertain future for the next 400 years, for the next 400 days. So I love the fact that we're having this conversation. I love the fact that we can sit down and talk about our history and talk about the fact that legally, socially, politically, culturally, the country has not lived up to the Constitution for African American citizens. We can very clearly say, and I can very clearly ask, that people that love Black culture, please love Black people and understand our existence in this country and how much of that existence was free labor to build the country that we all get to enjoy, to work day in and day out without any compensation is what went on. And that is a generational trauma for the country, and certainly a generational trauma for African Americans.
Yeah, I think a lot of white people right now, hopefully, are being asked and willing to take on that sitting with discomfort and examining themselves and interrogating their roles in these systems and calling out things that they see happening in their own communities and institutions in which they work and live and operate. I'm curious, though, I guess this speaks to the overall idea of white fragility, right? I mean, even going back to the myth of superiority, inferiority, that whole thing, the kind of colonizing of the Black body that happens in Get Out. There's this sense that white people are very fragile and don't want to sit with these feelings of discomfort, and we obviously need to. But I wonder if this is partly why, when there are any incremental steps in legislation or in society towards justice, towards making racial inequality, less unequal, that we're giving the Black community something as if it's not something that they should have had all along, as if other people are, people look at equality like this pie chart and that they're losing something. And some people fight against that, but I actually think that's sort of the point, right? I mean, white privilege is such that we need to start giving some of that up and being okay with that. So I'm curious what your experiences are with that in researching the film, or just in general, what your thoughts are on that whole kind of messy thing.
It's very interesting, white fragility and white privilege. The fact that these terms exist suggests that there's no privilege unless you're white, and that when you're white, you have the luxury to be fragile. You have the luxury to not have to withstand oppression. It's a very funny thing when you look back at 1936 and you're able to see how the Black female athlete is regarded versus the white female athlete, and how the Black female athlete is described in newspapers versus the angelic track stars who were white women. I think at the end of the day, the idea of white privilege exists when you colonize people, like in the movie Get Out, Sarah, which was so incredibly brilliant because it demonstrated colonization in the most physical, horrific way, right? To literally take over someone's body and have the privilege to do so. And that type of visual depiction is incredible. And if we think about it like that, what kind of a privilege would one human being think they are owed in order to control and own another human being? That's an absurd privilege. And that is a privilege that created tremendous wealth and economy and built a country. So that type of privilege is very, very hard to want to give up. It's very hard to admit, and certainly very difficult to want to give up. But the idea of sharing the privilege is crazy. The privilege is a right when you're born into the world, right? We're all human beings. We belong to humankind. So one group of people can't own more of the world's existence versus someone else who inhabits it. Because if that's true, as a Black woman, that renders my existence and my ability to occupy space on this planet as negligible, that I can never fully enjoy the planet. I'll never be safe to call the planet home. I'll never be safe to call America home if we don't democratize the existence and remove the idea of white privilege. It should not even be a thing.
There is this American idea of individualism, which I wonder if that gets mixed up with the racial dynamics in a way that makes it harder, because it makes it harder for white people to accept the idea of white privilege, makes it harder for white people to accept the idea that they have been advantaged simply because they're white. Because, the thing that I hear when I talk about this subject with people who are, they're not necessarily against the idea of racial equality. It's just that they don't think about it very much. And so when they're forced to think about it, when they're confronted about it, when I talk with them about it, the thing I hear most often is, I didn't have an advantage. I faced hurdles. I faced obstacles. And they can't get beyond their individual experience to see that there is a larger communal system in place, that they don't have to have lived a life free of obstacles. They don't have to have lived a life free of any challenges to have been advantaged, but they just can't see it that way. And, for me, I was born Christian, white, Anglo-Saxon pride. I converted to Judaism, and I'm constantly asked, what was it about Judaism that appealed to you? And one of the things was that Judaism is a explicitly communal identity. An individual Jew has their identity, but the idea of individualism as being preeminent is not there in Judaism. You need a minyan of 10 to pray. You need a community around you, and it forces you to think through the prism of communal experience, of communal institutions and systems, which I hugely appreciate, because I think that that's an important facet of how you think about the experience that you have in society. But that American mythology around the rugged individual pioneer who goes out and carves for themselves whatever it is that they have, I think is a major contributing factor to the challenge that a lot of people have accepting that they have been privileged and advantaged simply because they're white.
I agree with you. And that individual that pioneer who may have gone west, or that person who may have bought a farmland in the South and then, accumulated 1,000 slaves to work that land. That is a rugged individualist. That's what robber barons are about in some ways, right? So what people don't understand is that is a privilege because you did not have a law that says you cannot own land. There was not a law written about you saying you could not read. There was not a law written saying you could not marry. There was not a law that regulated your freedom, that regulated how you could move from state to state or plantation to plantation. So the aggregate of all these laws and customs and the construct of white privilege to colonize and oppress, you don't have to think about it because you didn't have to live it. So not having that lived experience certainly makes it very far removed, and not having that lived experience in your family at all. If it didn't happen to your grandparents, or it didn't happen to your great grandparents, or it didn't happen to your parents, it gets farther and farther away. So you don't think about that advantage. But if you have the disadvantage, it's constant because there's still rules and laws on the books at certain places to this day. And there's certainly the thought and the sentiment of racism, but it's institutionalized in such a way that's as common as the threads in the flag.
I'm curious about something that has come up in recent protests. It came up in your film, and to me, I think it came out of what we just talked about a little bit ago around the idea that if we make incremental steps towards justice, if we make small steps towards making racial inequality less unequal, that we're giving something to the Black community, and that they should be thankful for that, which is insane. But there's also this notion that these athletes should have been grateful that they were there. And today, when we hear athletes like LeBron James speak out in support of Black Lives Matter, and you get the Laura Ingrams of the world saying, essentially, shut up and dribble. You get to make millions of dollars. You get to be a celebrity. Just be thankful and shut the hell up. We don't want to hear from you. What is this? They seem to go together, this notion that you should be thankful when you're given crumbs, and given things that you should have had all along, that you had, that are basic human rights, but also that we want to take from you your cultural output. Whether you're an athlete or whether you're an entertainer back in the 40s and 50s who were playing in stages in hotels that you could never stay in. I mean, this notion of, hey, you get these things, just shut up. But they seem linked together, but it's also it seems so obvious to me that that's offensive. It seems so obvious to me that that's an insane position to take, because the implication is, hey, look, we're in control here. We're giving you some scraps. We're giving you some stuff. Just be grateful. Just shut up. And how that does not seem offensive to the people who are saying it, or some version of it, just seems odd to me.
It shouldn't seem odd to you, Brad. Let's think about it for a second. So in Virginia, throughout the South, when there were slaves, the good slave owners always said, and this is them talking because they call themselves good, no one else did. They took great care of their slaves. They gave them great scraps of food, great scraps of clothing to wear, and they made sure that they had some kind of, lean-to shack to keep them out of the weather. And that was considered, doing right by the slave. So the slave expecting anything equal never crossed the slave owner's mind. So you fast forward, it's like, look, I'm giving you this. Be quiet, because it goes back to be quiet on the plantation or you will get whipped. You will get those lashes. The overseer will ride over on that horse and pull out that whip and crack it across your back. So this idea, again, is around control, but also control and punishment. Like, I'm going to give you certain things, not what you deserve, not what you've earned, not what is equal, but what I deem appropriate and sufficient. And once I do that, I need you to behave. So the two things are, because that's a privilege, right? And that's also a hierarchy. And it's also when someone says that, in their minds, they don't see someone else as equal. They don't see themselves as on the same level. They are immediately subjugating someone else and oppressing them and colonizing them. But they don't realize that because they don't want to realize that. Self-awareness is an interesting thing. Most people are incredibly self-aware. They just pretend that they aren't because it's easier. And is certainly more beneficial. And shut up and dribble is kind of so closely related to just go pick the cotton. It's the same thing. This is not the table for you to sit at. You don't get to come in the big house unless we tell you. And then when we tell you to come in, or if you're invited in, you have to be exactly where we say. So when Booker T. Washington went to visit Teddy Roosevelt at the White House to have dinner, there was a huge outcry across the country. Teddy Roosevelt had a Negro sitting at the table. So this idea of people being like, for you, Brad, you love everyone at the table because you love community. That's not necessarily. People like having a lot of land and one person, the plantation owner, owning it. And all 1,000 other people outside of that owner's family are the subjects.
Yeah, it's that evolution of, we had feudalism in the Middle Ages, we had the divine right of kings, that went away, but we still had the same kind of structures. And I always try to remind myself that as a white man, I have blind spots because I don't experience in my lived day-to-day experience these kinds of racist interactions, these microaggressions. But I have a son, he's black, we adopted him. And I know that that's not going to be his experience. And on the one hand, I get what you're saying. I find it offensive as hell when I hear someone say something like shut up and dribble or anything remotely like that, because the implication is that, we are the ones in power. You are not. Shut up and know your role. But I also am aware of the fact that as conscious as I am, that that's the message that they're saying. And I don't share that philosophy. And so to me, it is troubling, it is puzzling, it is confusing. The reason that I am surprised by it is because I don't experience racism day to day. And so I have to constantly remind myself that I don't get to pat myself on the back because I don't feel racist. I have to remind myself that I am still advantaged because I'm white and I have an obligation, therefore, to speak up. So it's hard for me to parse because I have that immediate reaction of confusion of that's offensive. Why would you say that? Because I don't want to look into someone's heart and say that they're racist. But at the same time, I'm like, well, why would you say that? It says something about you that you would even say that. So I take your point. It's a matter of perspective, and it's a matter of, what's the subtext, I guess.
And it's going to become increasingly important for you as your son grows up and you have these very tough, challenging conversations with him, as you protect him as a father.
I would love to take some time, Deborah, to ask some questions about the filmmaking and your journey and experience as a filmmaker with this film and in general. One thing to start with, I'm just curious, we're obviously putting this film partly into the current context as well as looking at it in its historical context and tracing a lineage there. But as far as your filmmaking journey there, getting funding, getting distribution, what the reception was like, do you find, or did you find that telling this story of oppression as it was centered in the past, did that make it easier? Was it just that was just the story you wanted to tell? What led you to that? I'm just curious if you have other things in the works maybe that are that are more contemporary and what the differences are there. I just would love to hear a little bit more about your experience as from the filmmaking side of things.
Absolutely. This was a story I wanted to tell because it was a story that I didn't know. And I thought it was a very powerful story. And I thought, like Brad, I love teams and I love people coming together. And these 18 people, they were a family, they were a community of very young, talented, smart African-American athletes in the 30s who would go to Berlin, Germany and race in front of Hitler. I thought that was a very compelling story to tell. And as a filmmaker, as I did research on both continents, you really realize that this story about these athletes really is the story of America, a story of the world, a story of politics. So I wanted to be able to show that. And it's interesting because so much footage was available that we hadn't seen before that featured the African-American athlete, because in films previously, you didn't know that there were 18 that were present, right? Because you didn't see that slice of life from the 1936 Olympics. So I wanted to shed some light on their story and also bring balance to the story and not diminish their presence, because their presence there and their presence in the film sends a message about resilience, and it sends a message around this seminal moment and really kind of opening the door a little bit for the emergence of African American presence in sports, and then in the military, and then the fight for civil rights. So I'm an independent filmmaker. We raised the money. We had an executive producer. My husband and I were also part of the investors in the film. And making this film, we reached out to Blair Underwood to become an executive producer. He also narrated the film. This was something we thought was critically important, and certainly one that's set in 36 but feels relevant. And there's some just amazingly incredible races and that we included from an archival standpoint. And then we're able to bring in some very well-known athletes like Carl Lewis and Joanna Hayes. And of course, the 1968 Olympian Tommy Smith, who's forever remembered for raising his fist at the Mexico City Olympics, which is very relevant to Colin Kaepernick kneeling during an NFL game. So we thought the pieces of this story would be able to transcend time and not necessarily be an archival piece, although it is an archival piece. So we set about our journey finding scholars and finding people who actually attended the 1936 Olympics, who lived in Germany, who were spectators, to get their perspective on seeing Black athletes, and they shared that. We reached out to the families of these athletes because they had all passed away, to really build what we would hope to be a balanced story, understanding it from the athlete perspective, the spectator perspective, the political perspective, and being able to paint that picture in archives and personal memorabilia and photos from the people who had that lived experience.
I think your film, between the interviews and the archival footage, and exactly as you described, the way you weave all of these different perspectives together, it's one of my favorite documentaries that has taught me something and has, again, kind of forced me to examine a lot of these issues for myself and my role in them. And so the question I want to leave you with is, what do you, as a filmmaker, what do you feel is the power of the image, the power of filmmaking, whether that's documentary or narrative, to educate people and to inform people, and more than that, perhaps to really create some kind of change?
I think the image is the most powerful thing in the world. My next project is a narrative. I finished a short narrative about immigration, and immigration from the perspective of brown and Black people on the 4th of July, starring Jasmine Guy. It's a wonderful little short film that gets us to think about Independence Day and immigration and in America as one sort of thought. And the next film is a narrative film set in the 1960s on the south side of Chicago. It's a coming of age story about a little girl who's coming of age right as the civil rights comes to age. It's not a civil rights story. It's really about growing up and watching your world change around you. So I imagine there's a little 12-year-old girl right now that's watching her America change around her literally every day on television and around her. So what that looks like. And I think it's really, Sarah, a wonderful thing for all of us to sit in a theater, hopefully again, 6 feet apart, looking at characters and their journeys in America, whether the journeys are the same as ours or not, but really examining that experience and getting close to being empathetic about it and understanding someone else's lived experiences versus your own, and where or if privilege plays a role in yours, and how does that change your trajectory. And if you had that same experience, would your trajectory be the same or different based on how America sees you? I think it's important. I think for me, seeing a super smart, straight A 4.0 Black teenage girl on the big screen experiencing life in a way that's not a stereotype or a preconceived notion is important. It's important for everyone to see that image and absorb that image. So hopefully that breaks through so it can begin to penetrate these old ideals and these old images and all the vestiges of racism, and that we begin to see people as human and equal and a part of our thriving country. Because in order to be a thriving country, it takes a lot of different people. We all know the studies. Diversity in business is better for business. So I hope all of my films will continue to help people understand how and when they have ideas that really oppress someone else and how to have a conversation about that. I think there's the most powerful thing in the world is a film. I think the second most powerful thing in the world is a film festival, because you bring a lot of people together who ordinarily wouldn't sit by each other in some cases. And you have these amazing Q&As where you can talk about why a film was made, what you want an audience to see, what you want to leave an audience with. And people can go home and continue that conversation and watch that film again with their families and push out ideas that may be contrary to their own.
Deborah, thank you so much for being with us again.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Well, I think if you didn't notice, we said, I'm curious about a dozen times in this podcast, and I think that's because we are both struggling to try and understand the perspective of Black voices like Deborah's, who've lived very different lives than us. It's not just about curiosity, though. We have very real, very hard work ahead of us on this journey, and I think this conversation gives you plenty of things to think about and sit with.
And hopefully you are compelled to continue this journey of learning and unlearning, to continue to read, watch, and listen to experiences different from your own. There are so many films and books out there that will allow you to have these important conversations of your own in your own communities and circles. We will put some of those in the show notes. Until next time, we are your hosts, Sarah Glassberg
and Brad Pilcher.
Also producing are Catherine Crosby and Chris Holland, who is also our technical director and editor, and Catherine Cole, our show intern.
Thank you again to our special guest this week, Deborah Riley Draper.
The music you've been humming to all show long is by the incomparable Joe Alterman. Please look him up wherever you get your music.
You can always find more from us as well as the show notes at ajff.org/inconversation. Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Drop us a line with questions, and we just might answer in future episodes.
Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating, a review. Every little bit helps.
And of course, please tell your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.